Hello everyone, my name is Brian Ritchell, and this is my presentation on the role of the Chief Marketing Officer, otherwise known as a CMO. This presentation will consist of what a CMO is and does in the topic overview, some very successful CMOs at different firms around the world, some concepts about a role of the CMO, the article I have chosen, questions, and learning outcomes. The CMO is the head of the marketing department, the people who do the advertising. This is a very simplistic view of the CMO, but ultimately, he oversees the planning, development, and execution of an organization's marketing and advertising initiatives. The goal is to generate revenue by increasing sales through successful marketing and advertising. That is a very simplistic view. CMOs are very important because unlike a CFO or a CIO, CMOs have a direct effect on the way in which the company actually engages with its customers. Thus, it's very forward and outward, unlike internal chief officers. However, there is no perfectly defined role of a CMO, and they change from organization to organization, something we'll talk about later on. So some of the firms that have the most successful CMOs, according to Business Insider, include Procter & Gamble, GE, Adobe, Instagram, and Burger King. These CMOs have really redefined how CMOs are treated, and those companies have seen financial success because of these CMOs' success. As I mentioned earlier, the role of the CMO is not set in stone and can change from organization to organization. A CEO needs to understand which role they want in their organization. First is the enterprise-wide P&L role, or profit and loss role. This is the broadest role with a focus on design and implementation of marketing strategy, profit and loss responsibility, along with innovation, sales, distribution, and pricing. Only 23% of CMOs would fall under this category. Common companies with these types of CMOs are consumer packaged goods companies and single brand firms. These types of CMOs are often more general managers and likely to become CEOs of those companies in the future. The next type of role is more of a strategy role. They take the lead on firms' positioning and translate that positioning into the design of new products, services, and experiences. They also manage customer insights and analysis of data. They are the spearhead of the company's innovation efforts. Only 31% of the CMO positions would be defined as strategy role. They are more common in multi-brand firms. Lastly, the most common role is the commercialization role. This is considered a more downstream role as they use marketing to try and sell products that others have designed. They play more of a supporting role to what is driving innovation. An example would be if Apple engineers designed a phone and then went to the marketing division and gave them a phone to try and market through advertising, by traditional methods, online methods. This is a far more narrow role of the other two. Now with those concepts in hand, we'll look at the article Why CMOs Never Last by Kimberly Whitler and Neil Morgan. The goal of this article was to look at increasing the success of CMOs in organizations. CMOs traditionally have very low life expectancies within an organization, and oftentimes CEOs rate them the highest problem within an organization. 80% of CEOs said they have a problem with their CMO, while only 20% of those same CEOs said they have a problem with their CFO or CIO. So the first step they decided was to define the role. As we discussed earlier, which role does the CMO undertake? Are they an enterprise-wide role? Are they a strategic role? Are they a commercialization role? This can be affected by external factors and internal factors. Some of the external factors are the degree to which customer insight is needed to drive firm strategy. So, for instance, if there is not a lot of customer insight, polls, that kind of stuff to drive the firm strategy, then a more commercialization role with the CMO is probably more appropriate. However, if they need that kind of insight, the CMO's role as a strategy role or enterprise-wide role would be more appropriate. The second external factor would be how difficult it is to achieve firm-level growth. If it is easy to achieve firm-level growth, meaning the business is growing with little to no need for marketing, then simple commercialization advertising is all that's probably needed. However, with a difficult marketplace, the CMO will probably need to take a more strategic role within the. Lastly, the level of dynamic change in the marketplace is also an important fact. If the marketplace is changing dramatically, marketplaces are shifting, businesses are shifting, a strategic role of the CMO is probably more necessary. If it is a more static industry, hasn't changed, then a simple commercialization role might all you need. There are also internal factors when deciding which role the CMO should take. The first one would be the historic role within the company. If the role within the company had been narrow in the past, then it is probably going to continue to be narrow. It's hard to oftentimes a role of, say, a CMO, because oftentimes other C-suite executives will have already taken that role and have done so for a long time, and they might have even been doing it well. So taking those roles and broadening it can often be a challenge. The second is the structure of the firm. Now, when you get to much larger firms, a lot of the C-suite executives often are decentralized, disseminated across the business. There are multiple brands. Oftentimes, the CMO might be a glue to that. If that is necessary, then a strategic or enterprise-wide P&L role would be good. Or if it isn't, maybe just simple commercialization role would be all that is needed. The second point which the authors make to increase success of the CMOs is to match responsibilities to the job scope. In other words, if they just have a commercialization role, then that role needs to be matched to commercialization. They need to have a role for advertising online and traditional media. If the role includes research, they need to have the ability to go out and do research and take analysis for that job. Oftentimes there can be a misalignment between the responsibilities and what the job scope actually is. The third point is align metrics with expectations. This means that there needs to be specific metrics to which you can measure a CMO's effectiveness. This can be through sales, ROI, return on investment from what is invested in to marketing, and so forth. Only 22% of CMOs had actual measurements on their successes. This can often create a disconnect between the CEO's perception of the CMO and what the CMO actually brings. They should have budgetary goals and expectations that are real and measurable. Fourth, they need to find candidates with the right fit. So, only 6% of CMOs had degrees in actual marketing. 44% had the MBAs and came from very different backgrounds across different degrees in education, engineering, mathematics, philosophy, psychology, and other subjects. As a consequence of this, a CMO's experience is really what is critical to their success. Find a candidate that has the right experience for the company they want to work for. Another point to this is oftentimes the role that is advertised is not the role the candidate is getting. The article gave an example of a CMO who worked for Procter & Gamble, whose role was an enterprise-wide P&L role. She moved on to another company expecting a vastly similar role, as it was described to her before. However, when she got there, it was a very different role. It was more of a commercialization role than before, which gave her a lot less responsibility to do what she wanted to do, and she shortly left after that. Next are some questions I have for you guys. The first is, which of the three concepts, enterprise-wide profit and loss role, strategy role, commercialization role, do you think makes the CMO most effective? Do you think that there is some overreach in some of these roles? In other words, does the CMO become too broad and reach into COO, even CEO territory? The second question is, if you were a CMO, what general strategies and tactics would you use to expand your role in an organization. Let's say you were in a commercialization role and you felt you'd better serve the organization in a strategic role. How would you go about creating your role, enlarging your role? I will answer the first one. I believe the strategy role for a CMO is probably the most effective. The reason being that enterprise-wide P&L role means you're going to have a very broad role in the company. So it's almost too much for a CMO to handle at once. It works, and some of the best CMOs work for enterprise-wide P&L roles. And that's often why they are then tapped to be CEOs for those companies. But if you're looking to be a CMO, specifically a CMO, the strategy role gives you a say in how products are designed, the strategy for marketing those products, and actually implementing that. Commercialization role oftentimes is too narrow. You're just given something and you have to market it. And as a chief marketing officer, you would expect more of your job than that. And so yeah, I think there is some overreach in the enterprise wide role where you're starting to reach into CEO other territories that other chief executives have a say in. Lastly are the learning outcomes. First, not every CMO is going to have the exact same job description. I hope that made that very obvious. Every business has a different idea of what a CMO does. From a CMO perspective, it is important to know expectations before going in. As we saw, an alignment between the expectations and what actually is the job can often be different. And we saw this with the Procter & Gamble employee or CMO who then moved to a different position and was disappointed in the role being much more narrow than before. And she shortly left thereafter. Third, from a CEO perspective, it is important to know expectations as well as having defined measures for success for those CMOs and having candidates that meet those expectations. Meaning, you can't give the CMO simply, here's your goal, very vague, and expect them to meet that goal. Having specific expectations, a defined role, and then having candidates that you know have the experience to fulfill those goals. And lastly, every business in marketing is unique, and because of that, the role of the CMO is going to be different. Not all chief marketing executives are created equal. And that is what I hope you learned from this presentation. Thank you very much.